Okay, so for today's video, I actually wanted to do a take two on my Brother 1034D. After my last video, I had a large response of people wanting to know a little bit more information about calibrating and about sewing with certain fabrics. So I wanted to address some of your questions, and for today, we are going to do some real-time sewing. So you can actually see some of my methods without me speeding up or cutting around in the video. And hopefully this will help you guys out. So the biggest question that I have been getting is basically a step-by-step on how to calibrate my threads for certain fabrics. So I am actually going to show you on just a regular cotton type of fabric. This is just kind of a light to medium weight cotton fabric. This one actually does have a little bit of stretch to it. It is, I believe it's called I can't remember. I'll put it in the captions for you. And then the second fabric I'm going to show you is a Jersey knit. And a Jersey knit will stretch one way, but it will not stretch the other way. And then finally, I'm going to show you on a Lycra fabric, which stretches both ways. So that's a four-way stretch fabric. So what I'm actually going to do to start out is I'm going to put all of my dials back at 0. So you can see I have no tension on any of my threads up here. And then we're going to talk about the side of your machine right here, because this is where all the fun is at. This is where you need to know a little bit more information about all of these dials, because it can affect the way that you're stitching. So we're going to start from the front right here. This is actually the stitch width. And what that means is I serged a little bit on this edge right here. Come on, camera, focus. So you can see the width of the stitching from the edge. And this can be made skinnier or just ever so slightly bigger. I believe this is at a 6. So that's what this dial down here does. So the little lever right here actually disengages or re-engages your cutter, like your knife. So if you wanted to, let's say you wanted to roll over the side of a fabric right here, but you don't want to actually cut this edge, then you would disengage your knife and then stitch with this close to the cutter. I usually like to actually keep my cutter, let's say if I'm not using it, I'll keep it where it's almost fully in the down position. And then I can just kind of rest my fabric up against that side of that cutter, and it'll help guide it through there straight. So then this little knob back here is your stitch length. And you'll notice that there is the number 3 that is bolded out, and that is actually a very common stitch length to use with a serger. Now this last dial back here is called your differential feed. And what the differential feed does is it basically controls your feed dogs, which are these little teeth underneath your presser foot. And what happens is you have like your 0.07 and then your 1.0, which they have bolded out because that's the most common one on the differential feed. And this goes all the way up to 2.0. So if you have more of a fabric that does not stretch, most common with like thicker pieces of cotton fabric, you're going to probably put it between the 0 0.7 up to the 1.0. And the more that you increase your differential feed, what it is basically doing is it's your feed dogs pulling your fabric in at a different speed. So let's say if you put your differential feed at 2.0, that is going to be pulling your fabric a lot more than down here. So that actually can give you a ruffle in your fabric. When you're sewing with stretch fabric, you're going to be higher up on the dial toward the 2 because you don't want to have a ruffly edge unless you're trying to do the lettuce stitch, which we'll address in a different video because that's a whole different thing where you have to change parts on the inside of your machine as well. So what we're going to do, I have a tired puppy next to me. We're going to go ahead and put this all the way down to the bottom, and we are going to, let's just leave this one at a 3, and we are going to crank our stitch width all the way up to a 7. So that way we have the differential feed at a 0.7, the stitch length at a 3. We are using the knife and we're at the fullest stitch width. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my regular cotton and we're going to go ahead and we're going to fold it over. And we're going to stitch just so you guys can see an example of what this looks like at complete zeros. Okay, that is what we call a hot mess. You can see where there's just threads gumming up in the back, and it just is not pretty because there's no tension on any of these threads. And also one thing I do want to note, on my first and second cone, which are both my needles, I'm actually using a stretch thread, which I will put a link in the description box for that. That is not needed for serging, but I do a lot of serging with stretch fabrics, and I find that it makes the garment lay better and avoids popping stitches a lot more frequently with the stretch thread. So, and we'll get into that a little bit further in the video, but so this is what it looks like. And it doesn't really look too bad from the front, and I don't know how that is, but yeah, that looks pretty bad. So what I like to do is I like to go ahead and we're going to say, just for argument's sake, we're going to put, you can see the manufacturer has dashes in between your 3, your 4, and your 5 right here, because those are very common for where it's going to sit at its happy medium area, or whatever you want to call it. So we're going to go ahead and put your needle 1 and your needle 2 at 4, and then we're going to go ahead and we'll just put them all at 4s and see what it looks like. And we are going to go ahead and increase the differential feed up to our bolted out 1.0, and I'm going to increase my stitch just by 1 click, so it's between 3 and 4, and we'll go ahead and leave the width at the full 7. Now the width, it kind of will vary on your personal preference, and it depends on what you're trying to stitch. If you're doing like lingerie type of stuff, you're definitely going to want more of a delicate seam. Most of the costumes and garments that I do, I'm usually in between a 5 and a 7. I really do like the 7 though, because I think that the width that you get when you're stitching, the thicker width to me just feels more professional. But again, that's personal preference. So now that we've changed those, we're all at 4s, and we've changed the differential feed, the stitch length, we're going to go ahead and stitch and see what it looks like. Oh, and before we do that, one thing I did want to show you, with your first and your second needle, when you stitch, this is how you know that they're loose, is when you pull your fabric apart, and I'm barely touching this, and obviously this is at a 0, so it's going to do this, but if you get ladders on the inside of your garment and your seam, this ladder is actually caused by needle number 1. So you'll definitely want to tighten down your stitch number 1 because you don't want those ladders. Unless that's the look you're going for. Okay. Wow. Okay. So this is at all 4s. And you can see that it looks pretty good. I am noticing a few things that I would change. We'll turn this around to the back and look at this. And that's another way that you can identify the front and the back. The front of your stitching just looks like they're little up and down type of stitches. But when you turn it to the back, these look like teardrops or like the letter Y. And you can see they're quite a bit different. Just give you a better look at what it looks like. So for me personally, if I turn my fabric to this edge right here, you can kind of see, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see this fully or not, but I can kind of see that there's like a little pinprick where needle 2, where the thread is kind of pulling toward the back a little bit more. So I'm actually going to tighten that down just ever so slightly. Now, one thing that I do want to tell you guys is when you're going to tighten these down, you're not going to want to crank down on it and move it from like a 4 to a 5. Like I'm literally just barely touching. So it goes from like a 4 to a 4 point, or like maybe 4 1/4, if that makes any sense. You're just barely nudging them, and that's the best way that I have found to fix your stitching and everything, is to just barely touch your dial until you get to where you need to be. So now one thing I do want to point out is when you have this is your upper looper, this whole thread on the front of your fabric right here. This one that you're seeing is mainly your upper looper, which is your number 3. And this one that creates the Y in the back, the whole back of that is going to be your lower looper, which is number 4. So we're going to go ahead and take a quick stitch now that we've adjusted these just ever so slightly. And that actually does look pretty good. One thing I forgot to check last time is your ladders. If they look like little dots on the inside of your seam, that's okay. It kind of depends on, you know, if you're using a contrasting color like with the black and the white, or if your serging thread matches your fabric, then this isn't too noticeable. But I'm going to say right there, with how much you can see that, I am going to tighten my needle number 1 just ever so slightly. So then turning to the back, get a good look at this. And that looks pretty good. We're still getting a little pullage to the back, so I'm going to tighten down needle number 2 just ever so slightly. And it looks like the upper and lower looper are sitting right here. The upper and lower looper are meant to meet just on this edge of your fabric, is where they connect and stitch together. So I don't know how that happened, but I guess 4 is the lucky number for this sewing, or for this serger for today. So, and with this fabric. Now, what works on this fabric is not necessarily going to be what works on these other ones. So you want to check it every time you switch fabric, or every time you switch a project. You're going to want to recalibrate your thread, so that way that your stitching on the inside of your garment looks good. So now let's say this stitch is too chunky. Let's say you want something thinner. We're going to go ahead and knock this down to a 5. Now, when you actually go through and change your stitch width, it's going to change everything. And I'll show you right now. Come on, camera. Here we go. Okay, so here is the stitching, and if you can see this, it's the loops are coming up across the top of the edge of this fabric now, and you can see that it's loosened up in the back as well. So what we're going to want to do is tighten down our upper and lower looper, because you can see that that's what's sitting up above the top of the fabric. So we're going to go ahead and just ever so slightly tighten both of the upper and lower looper down, and then we're going to check for needle 1. And needle 1, I mean, it's black thread on white fabric, but it doesn't look too bad, and that's actually going to change after adjusting your upper and lower looper. That one might get tighter again. And it looks like the second needle is not pulling to the back, which we don't want it to do, and it's not, so we don't have to touch that one. So we'll go ahead and we'll try it again. Okay, so you can still see that the upper and the lower looper are pulling above the top of the fabric, so we're actually going to have to tighten those down just a little bit more. And you can see these stitches right here, you can tell that they're loose up at the top, and you don't want that. You actually want this serging to be tight. So again, we're going to go ahead and tighten it down just a little bit, and we're doing it equally. The upper and the lower, I'm equally adjusting them the same amount, because they are sitting on the top of the edge of the fabric where I want them. So we'll go ahead and stitch again. And it looks like we're getting a little bit closer, but we're going to need to tighten those down just a little bit more, because they are still sitting quite a bit above the top. Now, the reason that I tighten them down to where they're tight against the fabric is because, have you ever had a shirt that you wear and you go to stick your hand like through the sleeve or something, and maybe the tip of your fingernail or something, like your hangnail catches it, and then it pulls a run in the side of your fabric of your shirt? That's annoying. So this is how we're going to prevent that from happening. So go ahead and tighten down the upper and lower looper again. And this might seem kind of tedious, but this is the best way that I've found to make my adjustments. We're running out of fabric. Okay, that's almost pretty good. I mean, we still have to, we have a little bit of the thread hanging out at the top, but that's not bad enough that I would be too worried about it. And I don't know if you can tell the difference, but that is a lot closer to the fabric. I think that we could probably tighten down the upper looper just a little bit more and pull it to the inside, and you can see that those little polka dots are actually starting to disappear a little bit more as I'm tightening my upper and my lower looper. So we're going to stitch one more time just for good measure. And that is pretty good right there where it's at. I like the way that the stitching looks, and when I look down the side of the fabric this way, you can see that my needle 1 and needle 2 are taut to the fabric. They're not like poking up right here. And then we turn it to the back, and then these little Y stitches, look how they're supposed to, so they're tight against the fabric. And then we'll open it up, and it's just little teeny polka dots, so that's good. And that's how I would actually calibrate for this fabric. And you can see that you go through quite a bit of these little stitching, but you can see the difference from the very first one that we did to how it looks now. And then you can also see the difference in the stitch width. Okay, so the one thing that I would highly suggest is if you have a certain type of fabric that you use quite frequently in your shop, I would say until you get to really know the calibration for the proper materials, I would always take a notebook and I would actually just write down the type of fabric it is, and maybe put a scrap of the fabric, like staple it in your book, and write down what your needle size is and what your dials are up here and what your stitch length and your stitch width and your differential feed are. So that way, when you come to work with this same fabric that you've been working with after switching off to a different project, that you have kind of like a written note of, you know, to kind of remind you where to pick back up from. Okay, so before we move on from here, let's dive a little bit deeper. Now, I've kind of moved over to my secondary machine where I have the spools of thread that match the knobs on the front of my machine. And I have serged the edge of this white fabric just so you guys can kind of see what this stitching is supposed to look like. Now, when I very first started using a serger, this is what I did to troubleshoot and figure out what the serging stitches were supposed to look like. So you can see right here, we're going to talk about each one of these stitches. So your first cone is yellow, and that is your left needle. So if you look on your fabric right here, come on camera, keep up with me. Okay, so as you can see right here, we have this first line of stitching down here at the bottom, and that is yellow, so that means that's your first needle. The second needle is pink, and you can see this row of pink just above it. This loop that goes across the front of the fabric only is green, which is your number 3 knob, which is your upper looper. And then if you turn this fabric to the back, you're going to see the majority of this, when my camera focuses, the majority of the back of this is all blue, which means that's your lower looper. Now if you look really close, you can see a little titch of the pink, which means that's your second needle. But you can't see any of the yellow, and you can barely see any of the green at the very top of here. This is pretty close to what you're going to want to be looking at when your stitching is right. Now, I honestly think I could actually tighten down needle number 1 just ever so slightly. And again, when you're adjusting this, you just barely want to move your wheel just ever so slightly. You don't want to move it from 4 to 5. You want to move it to 4 and maybe one of these little steps on the side of your wheel. So I have this set at just over 5, about 4.5. This one's at about 3 3/4, and this one is at a 4. And then if you look at the side of my machine, down here I have my stitch width all the way over to 7. I have my differential feed at probably about 2 clicks above the 1. And then my stitch length is between 3 and 4, and I am using my cutter. So let's say we're going to back out just ever so slightly here so you guys can see. Let's say we want a little bit more delicate of an edge than that. And we're going to go ahead and roll the fabric over so we're stitching through 2 pieces of fabric. Now, that's another thing I wanted to tell you, is if you're only stitching through 1 piece of fabric, your stitches are going to be completely different than when you're stitching through 2 pieces or more of fabric. So you might have to make minor adjustments, but being able to identify which thread that you're looking at and know how to adjust that is really going to help you with your sewing. So we'll go ahead and we're just going to stitch and see what it looks like. Okay, so as you can see there, the whole front of this looks very green, which is a good sign because that means that our upper looper is fully covering the full length of this stitch. But you're also seeing that there's a little bit blue pulling to the front. So if this blue is actually pulling to the front, then that means that one of your stitches is too tight. But if you can see, with our stitch width, how we have it full to the 7, it's actually starting to pull the green to the back, which means that your upper looper is too loose and your lower looper is, lower looper is too tight. Now, let's say we want more of a delicate edge than this. So we're going to take it down to a 5. Again, because 5 is the most common width. So we're going to go ahead and stitch next to this one and see what it looks like. And another thing, I'm not pulling the fabric through, I'm not tugging either which way. I'm actually just pushing the fabric flat to the table and letting the machine do the work. Okay, so now that we've decreased the stitch width, you can definitely see that our upper looper is pulling to the back. So we're going to go ahead and loosen our lower, we're going to go ahead and loosen the lower looper, and we're going to go ahead and ever so slightly tighten the upper looper. And then another thing I'm noticing on the back of here is you're seeing a lot of pink polka dots, which means that that needle might actually be a little bit too tight. So we're going to go ahead and loosen the needle number 2 ever so slightly. You don't see needle number 1. And then we'll open it up and see what it looks like in here. And we're actually seeing more of the blue in here, which is, that's not very common. You shouldn't see all that blue. You should actually be seeing the yellow as opposed to the blue. So that means that the blue or the yellow needs to be tightened ever so slightly. So now that we have those adjusted, I'm going to go ahead and look at this stitching right here at the differential feed. We're going to drop that back down to 1. And the one thing that you're going to notice is when you make all of these adjustments, it's going to take a minute to calibrate it to the fabric that you're working with, but it will make the difference in the quality of your garment. Okay, so now that we've sewn that stitch, go ahead and take a really good look at it. You can see that our lower looper is actually pulling to the front right now. So we're going to go ahead and tighten down that lower looper just ever so slightly. And it looks like by the back of here, you can still see those pink dots, which means that that needle is still poking through the back. So we're actually going to tighten that down. And you might have to go back and forth and tightening and loosening to find the sweet spot for your stitches. And that's just kind of the name of the game, is to serge a little bit and then kind of check your work and see if it looks how you want it to look. And this is going really ham on calibrating. I think that not everyone, most average people are going to look at this and say, that's good enough, let's go. But I'm showing you how to really get that pristine, proper stitch for each fabric. And like I said, you don't have to really go this crazy, but I am showing you so you have that option. But that is a good stitch. You can't really see anything on the inside of here, and even though not everything looks exactly perfect on the inside, I mean, that stitch will work. But like I said, we're showing you because then you have that option and you know kind of a little bit better how to identify these stitches. So if you take a look at that, that actually looks the best that we've got it so far, because you can see all of the green, you can see a little bit of the blue kind of pulling through in the back right here, but that's not going to be bad because I've noticed that once we loosen or tighten that blue, which is the lower looper, that it pulls through a little bit more. You can see that the pink is barely showing through here. This also could be because I'm using a size 14 leather needle in here. So I actually have a pretty burly needle for this type of fabric. And that's another thing that you're going to want to be very cautious of, is that you're using the proper needle with the proper type of fabric that you're using. So whatever needle that you're using for a non-stretch type of fabric like a cotton, you're definitely going to want to change your needle to a stretch needle when you're working with stretchy fabric. Because, like I said, what works for this might not work for this. So now that you can see the different stitches in the colors of the threads, that'll help you identify where your problem is at. Now, I've had people tell me that they've had problems where there is tension issues where you're seeing most of your blue thread or most of your green thread, and it's kind of bunching up right here around this little knitting point. And I'm actually going to open this up and show you what I'm talking about. If you look really close right down in here, I'm going to go ahead and zoom you in. It's really funny. I'm filming this video and I had someone contact me and say that they were having problems. So this is for you. I hope you're watching. If you look right here on the side of your serger, you're supposed to see more of the blue around this needle. And if your thread is getting gummed up around this needle, one thing I would definitely say is make sure that your tails are tucked up underneath this platform back here. And the platform I'm talking about is like how you can see your foot. And I'll lift this up so you can get a really good view. This little metal bracket or platform right here that is involved with the foot, you want to make sure that all your threads are tucked up underneath that and hanging out the side. Because if your threads are actually going up over the top of this, that is going to prevent you from pulling your chain out the side that way. I hope that makes sense. Another reason why this is a really good way to calibrate your threads is, let's say that you're seeing too much of the pink, or let's say, you know, just for argument's sake, that your pink is like got a loop that keeps getting really big in between the stitching right here. Then you know that there's something wrong with your thread, or your thread attached to your needle number 2, which is your right needle. Another thing I want to say about tension is right above these knobs you have these little, it kind of looks like a button, but what this is this is the presser plates in between here that actually put the tension on your thread. That's, if you pull this to this right side, it pulls those plates apart so your thread is kind of free in between them. So one thing that I like to do is I like to make sure that I grab my green thread. Let me kind of back up here a little bit. I'm going to take my green thread from the base up here, and I'm going to hold it. And then I'm going to take the thread right here, and I'm going to pull it down and kind of floss it and make sure that it's tight in between those presser plates. And I usually like to do that to make sure that they are tight in between those presser plates with the 3 and 4 before I start sewing. Because if those aren't tight, you're going to end up with a bunch of chains on the inside of here that gum up your machine, and you'll get frustrated real quick. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump back over to the black machine and talk about stretch fabric.